So I'm Alex Sevilla, part of Houlihan Lokey's Government Services Investment Banking team. We're a proud sponsor of the Cybersecurity Summit. Many of the transactions that we advise on have cybersecurity involved as a capability set in some way, shape, or form. We've advised on 38 sell-side M&A transactions since 2014, valued over $6 billion. So a lot of the work that's being talked about here is very relevant for the community and what buyers are looking to acquire. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce the panelist and moderator for our next panel, which will focus on the state of cloud security and compliance. Susie Adams is the Chief Technology Officer for Microsoft's federal government business and brings with her over 30 years of IT experience, including holding several leadership positions in Microsoft, positions in Microsoft's, including the Director of Microsoft's Reston, Virginia Technology Center, and most recently the CTO of the Federal Civilian Business. Thank you, Susie. Next up is Matthew O'Connor, is a product manager of the Google Cloud Office of the CTO, based in Mountain View, California. Matthew, appreciate you coming up. He specializes in security, compliance, privacy, policy, and large-scale software services. Prior to joining the office of the CTO, O'Connor was responsible for security compliance products on the Google Cloud platform. Next up is Doug Van Dyke. Doug, why don't you welcome him up here. Is General Manager of the Amazon Web Services Public Sector Team. Thanks, Doug. Appreciate you coming up. Where he focuses on managing customer relationships with the U.S. federal civilian government and nonprofits. Prior to AWS, Doug spent 8 years in sales leadership at Microsoft in the U.S. federal government business, including as a senior director in Microsoft's Department of Defense sector. And our moderator today is John Woods. John, why don't you come on up? Who's the CEO and chairman of the board at Telos Corporation. Thanks, John. And an NVTC board member. In 2014, he was appointed by executive order by Governor Terry McAuliffe to serve on the Virginia Cybersecurity Commission. Thank you, everybody. John, over to you.
Can you guys hear okay? Great, thank you. First, I'd like to ask a question of everybody here in the room. How many of you guys are considering or have actually moved, quote, to the cloud? High raise of hands if you don't mind. Okay. And another question for you. So it's about maybe 35% of the room, roughly. Another question for you. How many of you guys have security as a concern about why you may or may not be moving to the cloud? Okay. 20%, something like that. So Gartner has a perception that says that the cloud's going to grow about 20% between this year and next year. And they say by 2020 that the number of people that are not on the cloud are going to be equivalent to the number of people that choose not to be on the internet. Think about that. Crazy, right? So today we've got 3 people with us, all of whom have been dealing with this issue of security and compliance and why the cloud is actually very secure and a good alternative to actually consider when you have an organization that's either a legacy organization with large-scale enterprise activity or a small organization that may just be starting out. And so what I'd like to do is to ask each of you guys to talk a little bit about your perceptions of security and compliance as relates to each of your organizations and how things have changed over the years. Because one of the things I've noticed is that, I wrote an article about 7 years ago that talked about why the cloud was more secure than on-prem. And I just got a tremendous amount of negative response. But then a funny thing happened. The Central Intelligence Agency made the decision that they were going to move to the cloud. Remember that? It was a crazy day, because here it was, the most security-conscious organization in the world decided to make this big move. And if you listen to John Edwards, the CIO of the CIA today, he compares the cloud to Superman. Faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, and a whole bunch of other analogies like that that are very interesting coming from the most security-conscious organization in the world. So why is there this disparity between security and compliance on the one hand and the rate of cloud adoption on the other? So I'm going to turn it over to my panelists and ask you guys to talk about a little bit how we can maybe over the next 20 minutes start to dispel that myth of how the cloud is less secure than other environments.
Well, John, since you're looking at me, I'm going to start. I apologize. So Jeff Bezos has a pretty famous quote: if you don't like criticism, for God's sake, never do anything innovative. So that may make you feel better about your article 7 years ago. You were an innovator, and therefore you got criticism. So in the last 6 years, I've been with Amazon Web Services. What I've seen the change has been completely profound. It's a 180. In fact, I saw on the agenda later today, we're going to be discussing NIST 800-171. And this could be the most exciting thing that's happened to me. So 6 years ago, when I would go in...
We live in a pretty dull world, don't we?
I know.
The most exciting thing that's ever happened to me.
It's
Children aside.
Yeah. Children, marriage, NIST 800-171.
Right up there.
So 6 years ago, I would walk into an agency and the discussion would go, the cloud isn't secure. And I would say, yeah, the cloud is secure. And I'd go, yeah, and well, it's not secure enough for us. And I would, then have a discussion. Well, prove it. Prove that it's secure. What NIST 800-171 has done is it is saying that now those third parties that are doing government contracting and doing researchers have to use the same or equivalent security standards that cloud service providers do. So now it's the flip argument. Are you as secure as the cloud service providers are? And for me, that's pretty profound. Maybe I should have toned down not the most exciting thing, but one of them.
All right, awesome. Matt, your perspective, you're dealing with security and compliance right down the middle. So what's going on in your world?
Well, I think we have had a similar experience where we've spent time doing the due diligence and helping our customers understand all the ins and outs and trying to provide as much information as possible so that they can make their own assessment. The interesting thing that we're finding is are things like NIST 800-171, where we're starting to see some common language so that people can understand security policies, procedures, controls, and it's done in a common way so that it's easier for people to do the diligence, and it becomes less and less high touch. It becomes more self-service. So the individual that's making the purchase decision or the individual that's making the technology investment decision has a dearth of has a vast amount of information available to them to make that educated decision and make it easier for them to convince themselves that the cloud is safe.
Now, Susie, with the recent executive order around cybersecurity, which basically was pushing a cloud-first policy, was pushing the adoption of the NIST framework, would you say to your customers in general that there are low-hanging fruit areas where people should invest first in cloud? And I guess maybe it depends on the size of the organization or maybe their legacy environments, but in general, given your background, when you think about it, Susie's been with Microsoft since '99. That's a long time. Like in AWS's world, that'd be like 300 years. So talk a little bit about that. You have a lot of experience here at the table.
Well, a couple of things. I think, when we think about, 10 years ago when we looked at, traditional IT shops, everybody really equated secure with compliant. Right? And when we look at where we're going as just an industry, an IT industry, compliance is really just a checkbox. It's just a series of controls, and the controls that say, thou shalt do this. You should have a firewall, you should have multi-factor auth, right? You need to meet these controls. And typically we look at those and you audit against those once a year, right? But if you look at the challenge that we have in front of us as we move to the cloud, what's really changed? And there's really, the security paradigm has changed. Right, we are no longer just protecting IT assets that live behind our firewall with guards and gates and guns. And if a bad actor or intruder gets in, we just disconnect from the internet. Right, that's not how it works anymore. The edge has moved. Right, there is now a virtual edge that you need to protect. And what's really happening is a couple of things. One, the security paradigm changed to identity is the new firewall and devices are the new edge. Data is going to move freely, whether it's in a hybrid cloud between multiple data centers or the devices that we're all carrying here, and you need to be able to protect that data regardless of where it is. Right? Now that's a daunting challenge. You throw cloud in there, right? And you look at this and you say, well, how am I going to protect this? And I think the thing that the cloud really brings to this is hyperscale compute and the ability to look at anomalies and look at sensor information that you're getting from all the devices at the edge, as well as all the devices in your data center or in the cloud data center, and you're able to make sense of this with big data analytics and machine learning. And so when I think about how agencies are approaching this, right, we're starting to see compliance automation. Right? We're no longer looking at it as we're going to audit once, we're going to have continuous compliance automation. Look at where the CDM is trying to head, right, with the federal government today. And so I think people are getting used to, we're going to have to change the way we look at security. We're going to have to assume breach. We're going to have to assume that we're going to have a virtual edge to our data centers, and we're going to need to learn to protect that data regardless of where it lives. And if you can make that paradigm shift in your head, then you clearly see that cloud providers can give you capabilities that you didn't have before to see anomalies that humans would never normally see.
So automation is key. One of the reasons why automation is key is because when you look at the NIST framework has like 1,100 controls. Now, obviously, that's a lot. So to the extent that you're able to bury as much automation as you can, what it does, it takes the work out of the manual processes and puts it in the hands of the systems themselves, because otherwise it becomes a very daunting task. Because in the past, security and compliance has taken some of our customers 18 to 24 months at a pop before they can move workloads, whether they be moving workloads to the cloud or even getting the ATO, the authority to operate within on-premises. So a thing I've been sort of struggling with in my head, and a question I have for you guys in general is the following. When you think about the rate of cloud adoption globally, it's very high. But here we are in the DC area, the Washington, DC area where the federal government is, and it's interesting with the NIST framework just being adopted. To me, it's interesting because if you look across the board in the federal government, 80% of IT spend is on maintenance. Now, if you compare that with my commercial customers, it's only about 22% is on maintenance, roughly. And yet, I find the government is having a harder time coming to grips with this movement to the cloud. And I was wondering if you could tell us what you've done on the commercial side about how you get those other big customers who have the same kind of issues that government organizations have. Maybe they have more spend, but they have the same kind of issues that these large legacy organizations have. But on the other hand, on the government side, it's been less willing to adopt. And I was just wondering if you've seen any nuggets that people can use here in the room that can convince their own organizations about why it makes sense. That's an open question for any of you guys, by the way.
So I think a couple of things. In the federal space, we see that some of the biggest changes are the regulatory issues that are out there today. If you look at the policies that are on the books today, things like the trusted internet connection, right? Just following the trusted internet connection mandate can cause huge challenges for agencies depending on how much network bandwidth they have. There's challenges with how do I actually get an ATO? Right, and what do I do? The process to get an ATO on a traditional IT system behind the data center, that ATO package was 20 pages. Right? You go and look at Amazon's or Microsoft's or Google's FedRAMP package, it's 1,000+ pages. Right? And everything's software defined. And so it's been very difficult, I think, for agencies to kind of wrap their head around what does this process look like for me to certify applications that I'm putting on these cloud providers in their data centers using their compliance packages, and then how do I comply with some of these outdated policies that are on the books that really haven't been changed in 10 years. Trusted internet connection, and I know Karen Evans is going to speak soon. I don't know if she's here now, but that's 2007. Right? That's 10 years old. And so I think we see that clearly playing a role in slowing the adoption. Think of the cap. Right, on the DoD side, right? They are not insurmountable, but they are definitely, throwing or extending the amount of time it takes for agencies to move mission-critical workloads to the cloud. If you look at our commercial counterparts, I think the other piece of this is that we see commercial customers being able to weigh cost versus benefit and the risks, and be able to make that risk-based decision. A little bit easier than their federal counterparts because of those policies.
Okay. Any of you guys?
Well, I'd build on that a little bit in that if you think about the ATO, it's also a very localized activity, and so there's not a cookie cutter or a standard way to do that across like the U.S. government, and so each of these particular agencies needs to. They need to invest in that process, and they need to invest with the vendors. The vendors will put the resources there, but it takes a long time. It's difficult, and as Susie points out, some of the standards that they're looking at are a decade old, and they just don't apply to a virtualized world or software-defined networks and things like that. So there's a part of that process involves a lot of education. Okay, here's how you understand that based upon the standard. Here's how this works 10 years later, and here's what you need to understand so that you can make that risk-reward trade-off and go, oh, okay, this meets the control, this meets the risk I'm trying to mitigate, it's just not done exactly the way the standard says it's done. Am I willing to accept that? And in some situations, the agencies are, and in other situations, it still makes them kind of nervous because they may be the first person encountering that, and they don't have anybody to look to across the government to say, oh, somebody else did that, I'm okay with this.
I think your other point, though, is that risk is different basically based on the program and or the agency. So people's
absolutely,
perception
absolutely.
of what's an acceptable risk will also be different, even if the definitions are exactly the same. Right?
Yes, and if you take a commercial example, I mean, one of the things that's interesting in a security conversation is the first thing you get to is, my data is very sensitive. And that's true with all of our customers. I can tell you that the filmed entertainment industry is very, very concerned about their intellectual property leaking out digitally. It's big revenue for them. And so they have the same kind of concerns as a classified programs data. It's just not everybody thinks about it that way, but we consider all of our customers' data in that manner.
Yep.
Yeah, so I'd like to add, there is a risk. How you define risk for your organization is really important, and there is a risk with not adopting these new technologies. And John, you asked the question, are there some commercial entities that have done a really good job moving to the cloud pretty quickly? The FINRA, the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, that's a quasi, it's a regulator, took the approach of moving their most mission-critical application first, OATS, their audit trail. And by moving their most mission-critical application first, then they hit all the blockers, and they were, moving anything else becomes, I won't say trivial, but a little bit less profound.
So it's almost counterintuitive in a sense, but it's really not, right? You take the thing that you're most concerned about, and if you're able to bridge the gap between those concerns and getting there, then everything else should follow.
Correct, and I think it's because, and I don't want to put words in their mouth, but they took the approach, they're responsible for monitoring and auditing the markets. And if the high-frequency traders have access to these newest technologies and they can move at light speed and do nano trades, they have to have an audit system that can track that. So there was a risk of not using the latest technologies. So by putting their most mission-critical application into the cloud first, then they were able to do their mission even better, and it moved their entire organization to the cloud relatively rapidly.
Susie.
I completely agree. If you look at just the cybersecurity challenge that federal agencies face today, if you could apply machine learning and big data analytics to all the sensor information you're getting at your data centers, not just the net flow data that we're used to looking at and looking at log files, but you could consume all that, plus all the sensor information you're getting from all these devices, right, from all the applications. What if you could see if somebody logged in to a particular app in one region in the country, and then simultaneously or very close to that in some other part of the world, and you could see that anomaly, right? The both valid credentials, right? We don't look for those things today. The bad actors out there, they are using the cloud, right? If you are not to protect your infrastructure, you're going to have a breach. And I don't think that people really think about it that way today, but that's the good and bad news of the technology being available as widely as it is today on a global basis. And so I do think it's really, really important that the federal government really take advantage, right, and spend the time to invest in this new technology so that we don't fall behind as a country.
So how many of you guys know who Bobby Kilberg is? Can you raise your hand? So Bobby Kilberg is the CEO of Northern Virginia Technology Council, and she is a force to be reckoned with. So this is her conference. She's over there. She said to me, hey, make room for questions. So we're going to ask one or two more, and then I'm going to ask you guys to see if you have any questions of our panelists, just so we do that, because I don't want Bobby mad at me. She's small, but she's tough. She's smaller than you were, but she's still tough. So one of the things I want to ask about is so cloud adoption, I think, is actually beginning to happen. I think on the cloud provider side, there's a lot more being done around automation, around security and compliance. And as long as the customers get that benefit of that automation of security and compliance, and they adopt that same automation standpoint, the rate of adoption is definitely going to go up. But let me ask a question about what's going to set the cloud back? Tell me, give me sort of an idea in your mind's eye about what could really set the cloud back. Based on a lot of the conversations you guys have had, Matt, you've been with your organization for a long time too. So just tell me what you've seen out there in the world where people are concerned about what could really set the cloud adoption back.
So there's two things that we think about in terms of a setback, and one is that one of our customers has a significant incident on our infrastructure, and so something on the order of the Equifax incident or something like that happens on our infrastructure. That's one thing that really concerns us. The other thing, to be quite honest, that is also concerning is a heavy hand of regulation. There's previous speaker was mentioning some concerns about the political climate affecting markets. We see signals around the globe of various governments being interested in injecting a lot of regulation that's not there now, and I think that we look forward to doing those types of things in a collaborative manner as opposed to just being dictated to.
Yep. Okay. So not heavy regulation, but really making sure that you have a solid focus on the investment required around security.
Absolutely.
Okay. Doug.
Yeah, education and training. I think that when I look at the customers who have adopted the cloud very rapidly, they have embraced the new technology. They've trained not just the technologists responsible for it, but the business people who manage the mission. So I think education and training, is the opportunity. A lack of it is what concerns me.
Yep. Okay. Awesome. Susie?
I agree with both. I see both. I mean, obviously, we're all afraid of that one big breach.
Yep.
I think that, all of society is, and it's probably inevitable. I think the good thing about these three, hyperscale companies is that we have a significant cybersecurity presence in our own organization, so that wouldn't go on for long. And we all also share information behind the scenes on cybersecurity incidents, right, as well as with the federal government. But to me, one of the biggest challenges with cloud adoption is, if you think about, in 2010, I can remember talking to some of our cloud engineers, and they said, yeah, data's gonna follow the sun, and data's gonna be able to live anywhere in the world, and we all kind of believed that. And that quickly came to a screeching halt, because globally, data location and data access matter. And I think, the industry had to learn that the hard way. And if you look at some of the regulatory challenges that we have globally, it's because of data access, data location. Do you have to have citizens of that nationality actually managing that data center for the government and or the citizens to be able to use that data and feel comfortable from a regulatory perspective that that data is not going to be used? And I do think that is going to be one of the biggest challenges. If you compare that, historically to things like the telco industry. Right? There are international treaties that allow the telco industry to function the way it does globally. There aren't those treaties today with cloud. And we've been trying as an industry, I think, for well over 10 years now to try to have those types of conversations. But I think clearly the climate we're in today is not going to lend itself well to that. So I think that we at Microsoft, we've learned kind of how to deal with this problem when we actually build sovereign clouds, and those sovereign clouds are literally just stamps of our commercial cloud globally. And we can replicate those sovereign clouds now anywhere, and that's in fact what we're doing for the federal government.
So it's a
in the
cloud
US.
in each country.
Think of it as a cloud in the cloud, right? And they can be on physically isolated networks with U.S. Nationals or nationals of that particular country running it, but yet it's the same evergreen service that you know and love on our commercial cloud. Right? There's really no difference. I mean, it might be a little behind from a feature parity perspective, but it will catch up. And the reason it will catch up is it's not a one-off.
And
right?
I'm,
But this
I'm
was a difficult
assuming
thing
that's
to do.
basically the same with the rest
It
of my
sounds
providers here,
familiar.
right? Roughly, roughly.
Yeah, and this has been really expensive for the companies that you see up here. This has not been cheap to do. I mean, we've invested over $600 million just in the United States, or $750 million just in the United States, just trying to figure that out to be able to deliver for government. And if you think about what you have to do on a global basis, what about the UK? What about Germany? What about each one of these countries has their own rules and regulations? China, Japan, and so to grow, as an international company, that I think this will. I don't think it's going to slow down the U.S. I think we're doing well here, but I think if you talk about it globally, that's the one thing I think probably needs to be worked out for it really to just go off the Richter scale.
So one of the things I have seen the large cloud providers do that some of my federal, state, local education customers have had a hard time with, because I think they're publicly funded, so there's this really reluctance to make that huge investment that's really necessary up front. And and it goes back to that point I made about the federal government. 80% of IT spend is in maintenance, right? A lot of legacy out there that we got to see moving, because that legacy issue is also a massive information security risk in general. So I'd like to open up the floor to any questions there might be here for you guys. Hopefully not that many of you guys are checking out your iPhones. I see a couple. Just joking. Bobby, there's a question over here. Yes, sir.
I'm not sure if this is on. Oh, it is. Good discussion about breaches in particular. I was wondering, there's three actors at least in a breach. There's of course you, the hosting agent, there's the adversary, there's the customer. Could you talk a little bit about the responsibilities of the customer hosting in a cloud environment? Because although you've invested a lot of security, the customer may not be necessarily sophisticated as your capabilities. Can you talk a little bit about what advice you give those customers?
That's a great question. It's around the so-called shared model, right?
Yeah, I'll do a real quick response. In every situation I can think of, technically, security is a shared model. Even on your iPhone, you've got to create your own ID and remember your ID and set up words to help with your provider. So we look at a shared security model, and obviously that there's different levels of that shared security model. But back to John's question, what concerns me, education. And I think there could be an assumption by some users coming into a cloud that, I don't need to worry about security at all anymore. That's someone else's problem. And I think we need to create an environment where everyone understands not just that security is everyone's responsibility, but their role in ensuring that security happens at all three of those levels. And if we don't educate correctly on, and there's varying degrees of responsibility depending on what service you use, we need to make sure that education is there and that each of those players is doing their part.
I couldn't agree more with everything Doug said. To add on top of that, one of the things that we're trying to do is actually give our customers visibility into the solutions they're actually running in the cloud and give them access to the log file data and any of the signals that they can get out of the cloud that they're actually hosting their application on, whether that be a SaaS app like Office 365 or an infrastructure as a service app running on top of Azure. And so we want to give them all that telemetry. Give them the ability, we have something called Azure Security Center that can let them look at that in the cloud, but then also allow them to take that information and telemetry and import that into whatever SIM tool that they're using on premise so that they can start to see that data and be able to bridge that gap, because it is, there is customer responsibility in this. And so it does come all down to education and making sure that the cloud that you're using is transparent as possible and is giving you as much of that telemetry or visibility into that telemetry as humanly possible right now to be able to see those anomalies.
The other piece of it is that in a shared security model, you can also look at your cloud provider as a force multiplier. And what I mean by that is that there are just aspects of what you're building and what you're serving to your users that you won't have to worry about. And I don't mean you don't have to worry about it, because the CISO needs to be thinking about all of that, but they don't have to actively manage that. They can take advantage of what the cloud providers have put in place. Now, as Susie said, there's a big push to provide as much transparency there as possible, so it's easier for you to make those decisions as a buyer and say, okay, I'm comfortable with this because not only do I trust them, but I have the ability to verify this in some manner. I think the trend you're going to see in the not too distant future is you'll start to see more management of the security aspects of service move up the stack. And I think that that's going to be a function of two things. One, the scale of things is going to get large enough that it's going to be difficult for individual companies to hire enough personnel to do it. And the other thing is that with expanded usage of cloud services, the level of trust, because there is evidence that verifies that good things are happening, will go up. And so customers will start to demand more of that be managed for them. So I think you're going to see some really interesting innovation in terms of features and products that will be available to customers of cloud providers in that realm.
Yeah, and I just want to sort of put stop a point you made as well, and it's a point Doug made as well earlier. If you were to read the Verizon breach report, which if you've never read a report on vulnerabilities and exploits, it's a great report. It's been around forever. Lots of good pictures, so guys like me don't have to actually read. But what you'll see in that report is that probably 85% in each of the last 10 years of the exploits are things that education and training would have absolutely mitigated those risks. And so at the end of the day, a lot of the bad guys out there are exploiting very low-hanging fruit that is easy to get rid of if people were to take advantage of education and training, honestly. We got that company here that was here earlier, FishMe, great Leesburg company. Those guys will tell you all about it, how important training is to deal with those sort of phishing exploits that are out there all day long that most of us have to deal with all day long as companies. So, Doug, you were going to say something.
I was just going to say, I think we should all mark this date on our calendar, because you've got Microsoft, Google, and Amazon on stage in violent agreement. And has anyone else noticed? That's pretty profound. There must be something here.
With Telos.
I think we're on to something. With Telos.
And I was going to ask these guys questions about how they're different and why one's better than the other, and I was told that's just not a good idea for today. So
no, this is a love fest.
It's a love fest. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm curious how robust IoT business is with interacting with cloud, and then in what sense are you offering security services for IoT devices if your customer is bringing an IoT device to connect to your cloud?
And you guys want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I'll start.
Perfect.
So one of the interesting things that we see kind of about the IoT space is, there's an application, just a framework that, typically an IoT type of solution will follow, right? You obviously have the IoT device, which I have one on my wrist right now, that's going to give, basically going to give data, right, to some location. Maybe it's the cloud. Right, we have something called the IoT hub, then that takes that data and they put it in a data store and you perform analysis on that data. And so one of the things that we see that's one of the bigger challenges here, obviously the security of the device itself and the fact that there's not really any standards out there for the security device, but aside from that, one of the things we're doing is really creating kind of an intelligent edge, and we call it the Azure Iot Edge. And so it will give you the ability to have, think of it as Azure type cloud services, machine learning, that will work, computational capabilities that will work inside containers that live on the edge and actually on the device, running in 128K. right? That's all the memory you'll need. And so we really are starting to look at how do we actually move some of the computational power to the edge in small bites and take advantage of things like containers and serverless compute. To be able to take that information, make sense of it on the edge, secure that data before it's actually transported to a larger data store that might be living in the cloud, to be able to make sense of that information, because it's a very transactional type of environment. A lot of data moves back and forth, and the security of that data, both at rest and in transit, is the most important. So do we have the complete solution? Has everybody figured this out? I think the answer to that is no. But I think there really is some really great work that we're doing and others in the industry are doing to try to make this a enterprise capability where the data can be secured from the time it's collected on whatever sensor or device is collecting it, all the way from the edge to the data center.
Yeah, we have a saying, security is job zero. And if it's not secure, it doesn't connect. And that's the approach we're taking with the Internet of Things. And what Susie said is very true. Opening this up to thousands, millions, billions, trillions of sensors, you need to be very astute about what you're letting connect. And so you have to have a security check before it connects to deliver the data.
Which kind of goes back to something you had said earlier, Matt, I think about the NIST and reciprocity, a common language, being able to come up with a trusted approach. Reciprocity is a big deal in general even outside of the government. So to the extent we could do that, I think it's very good. Did you have anything you want to finish with, Matt?
Well, I was going to say two other things on the Internet of Things. Is one, we have a whole stack that we can make available from device all the way into the cloud, and we have customers that are taking advantage of that. But we also look at this as an opportunity to engage at a deeper level with a customer who's thinking about a deployment or may have a deployment and wants to take advantage of big data analysis or machine learning. How can we partner with you and walk through your architecture and help you make sure that you're making the right decisions so that your complete chain of data is secure? Because some of it's new. And so, we have the advantage of having a pretty big Internet of Things that we get a lot of experience off of, and we're willing to roll up our sleeves with our customers and look at that and say, hey, we've learned this lesson, let's help you avoid making the mistake that we've made. And so we have a lot of engagement at that level as well.
I think it's hilarious when he says pretty big. When you think about the market cap of these three companies combined, yeah, they're pretty big. Any other questions? Yes, sir. I think we have time for one more. We have till 9:45? Oh, I thought it was 9:30. Oh, wow. We have plenty of time for coffee. Okay, good.
Somebody just said 9:30.
Maybe we'll ask a few. Good morning. Thanks, everyone. So I wanted to just follow up. I think it was Doug made the point about NIST 800-171 and how important that is. Kind of
Best day of his life, he said.
right, best of
One of
right,
top
right.
top five.
At
Which
least
is very
top five.
scary.
So we've been doing a lot of work with companies in that, and it seems to me there was a directive, as I'm sure you know, in September from the DoD going out to all the buyers saying, hey, technically or officially everybody, all the contractors, subcontractors have to be compliant by December 31st, 2017. But we found in the marketplace that seems to be a little fuzzy, and especially in the subcontractor network, maybe not the large contractors, but in the sub network, it maybe doesn't have enough visibility, and there isn't enough understanding of the risks in not being compliant. So here's the question, at least that's been our experience. What do you see as the federal government's directive in saying, hey, listen, you do have to officially be compliant and show that you are compliant, not that you're just trying? Is that first quarter next year? Is it second quarter next year for all of the NIST 800-171, specific to how that ramps from the DFARS compliance requirements?
Yeah.
You want to take a crack at it?
Well, can I defer?
Sure.
Can I phone a friend?
Sure.
All right.
So I think it's going to depend. If you're an agency, it's going to be very important to adhere to the deadline. I think it's also going to be interesting because if the subcontractor is not adhering, it's going to depend on the agency how they respond. So I don't think that I still think it's cloudy. I don't think it's hard set down to the subcontractor level. But I do think it's going to be dependent upon that agency subcontractor relationship or prime subcontractor relationship. A lot of the big primes are moving out swiftly, but it's a lot easier for the big primes to move out swiftly. They have more resources. So to your point, it's going to be something that's going to take some time, I think. Susie?
So I agree with you. I think, if you just take this up a level, I think one of the biggest challenges with whether it's DFARS or, NIST 853 Rev 4, or whether it's the DoD SRG level 4, 5, 6, any way you look at these controls, I think one of the biggest challenges is that we're still kind of stuck back in the 2010 or earlier time frame, where we look at a particular way a control is implemented. So we say, here's the risk that we're trying to mitigate, and here's how you're going to protect against it. You're going to use a firewall, and that firewall is going to do X, Y, Z. And taking that approach, which is somewhat of a risk-based approach, but it's very ingrained in this is how we've always done it, versus this is how we can now protect ourselves because we're using innovative technology. And so I think, if you look at where I think globally people will be going is to more of an outcomes-based approach. Here's the risk I'm trying to mitigate, and I'm going to let the innovation that's happening in the industry help me mitigate against that risk, because the bad actors are learning just as quickly as the industry itself. And if you don't do that, and you don't take an outcomes-based approach and allow people to protect that data using innovative new techniques, and instead force them to use technology that might be 10 years old or 6 years old or even a year old, you're going to run into challenges long term. And so what we're really hoping is that when you look at these standards long term, that they'll go to an outcomes-based approach, and they'll say, this particular control is trying to mitigate this risk. Now, you prove to me how you mitigate that risk. Is it through software-based technology? Is it through how are you mitigating that risk? Convince me. I'm not going to tell you how to mitigate it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so that was a stall tactic while I thought up the answer that I would give. And I agree, and I think that if we look back to 853 in FedRAMP, when that came out, and use that as an example, held to it pretty firm, the FedRAMP office did, for compliance for cloud service providers. And then there were periods of actions, milestones, POAMs that, everyone, if you're going to be a commercial cloud service provider working in the federal business, you have to either have FedRAMP, or for those workloads that you don't, you have to provide a plan to get there. So, I think the government is going to be pretty particular with this one, but I think if just using FedRAMP as an example, it'll probably be a similar approach.
I also think what's going to happen is the cloud providers are going to start doing more and more prepackaged templates, where they're going to be able to take some of the controls that they provide and push those out in an automated format, which will help a lot with that process overall, to the extent that people are adopting cloud.
And we're already doing that. I think everybody here has a template that says, here's how we document these controls, and here's the customer responsibilities. Right? And then you fill out this part of the system security plan, and away you go. And by the way, here's some best practices for implementing your customer controls yourself.
But Susie, I want to say one thing, though. I'm not talking about Excel spreadsheets. I'm not talking about Word documents. I'm not talking about PowerPoint. I'm not talking about PDFs. I'm talking about stuff that's you have to be able to automate. And you can't automate a Word document. So at the end of the day, that shared security model needs shared automation as well, I think. And truth be told, I have an axe to grind in this area, because that's the world I've been living in since 1990. So truth be told, that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, no, and I think that's the next step. So right now, I know we're looking at how do we actually automate these controls? Yep. How do you verify that control is still in place? It's not that easy, though, because as I said, the FedRAMP controls, the way they're written, or the 853 controls, the way they're written today, are very implementation heavy versus trying to mitigate a risk. And so how do you tell, a cloud provider? I mean, for example, if you were to run a traditional scanner on our networks, we would get all kinds of false positives, and we do. And we spend a lot of time validating that is a false positive. And the reason is because everything in our data centers is software defined. Right? And some of the scanners are not up to date with some of the new technology that we're actually running to mitigate those risks. And so it is a challenge. It's not going to be a cut and dry kind of approach.
Well, and you also run into situations where you have something that's mandated, like, for example, don't use this cipher because it's not safe. But what that fails to recognize is that the protocol starts at the top of the cipher list and works its way down. Now, the reason that a cloud provider may have that low-level cipher in there is because they're serving a global customer base, and there are still people with Windows NT machines that's the only encryption that they're going to get. And so you get into this argument of, is some encryption, even if it's weak encryption, better than no encryption? I mean, and so you that's very implementation specific, as opposed to what's the risk we're trying to mitigate. The risk we're trying to mitigate is that the communication over that web channel is not being intercepted.
Wow, Windows NT. Sounds like Autoden. That's a little.
It's not a big
dumb humor.
population, but there are some out there.
I know, I'm joking. Any other questions? Yes, miss.
With the government moving with the cyber executive order into shared services, there seems to be a big focus on that in government right now. Can any of you speak to how that impacts your cybersecurity regulations and moving forward with that?
I apologize, I could not hear that question.
Okay, sorry. With the cybersecurity executive order, government services are moving more to shared services. And I was wondering how that's impacting your work with federal government and how you're communicating with federal agencies to learn more what they're looking to understand and try and meet their needs.
Okay.
I think cyber, so if I heard the question correctly, if we're talking about shared services, so I know that there's a big push for cybersecurity shared services, for example. Can the federal government use cybersecurity shared services? And I think the answer, I think that is going to help the cybersecurity problem. I mean, I know one of the things, that we try to talk to officials in the federal government about is, hey, you need to approach this problem, this CDM problem, the trusted internet connection problem, like the major cloud providers are today, right? We're using big data analytics, machine learning. We're looking at a lot more than just NetFlow data to be able to secure our data centers and our resources. And so we'd love to be able to extend those same capabilities that we have today to the federal government so they can collect all that information and do it as well in a shared service running in a multi-tenant cloud. And so that, I think, is where shared services will intersect with cybersecurity is, can we actually start to take advantage of hyperscale compute and multi-tenant cloud capabilities that are out there today to start to see anomalies that we typically wouldn't see by just looking, for example, at NetFlow data or just checking the box on a compliance control.
Amen.
And I would also assert that shared services actually give you a better profile in terms of a cybersecurity point of view, because if you can, you're not making copies of data. You're not having data strewn all over the place for different people to take advantage of it. You can control it in one place. You can control that access. You can see the access. You can log that access. You can revoke that access when it's no longer necessary. And you can do all of this much more simply with your data or your service in one place.
So going back to the point about shared services, they go back to the issue about reciprocity. And the story I like to tell about reciprocity is right after September 11th, there was a meeting of a bunch of people in the intelligence community, of which I was proud to be a part of. And the question on the stage by two senior people who were chief security types was, when are we going to do a better job of sharing data? One person said, not in my lifetime. And another person said, in 50 years. This is right after September 11th. And I was like, wow, that is horrible to hear. Well, the truth of the matter is, if you fast forward to where we are today, the intelligence community has done very far, way far better off than those two people said. There's a great deal of collaboration going on, a great deal of, if you will, reciprocity happening, a much more trust going on between the agencies. And again, I think that shared language is helping to deal with the issue of reciprocity, where you can get to shared services and multi-tenant and so forth. So, any other questions over here, sir?
Yeah, hi. So I'm one of the startups here from Mach 37, one of the sponsors, and I'm going to put you guys on the spot a little bit. Are you guys going to offer the ability to provision bare metal machines inside of your clouds anytime soon? Because I've had to go with one of your competitors because I don't have that ability yet. So that's my question. When can I provision bare metal inside of Google, Amazon, or Microsoft?
All right.
Well, I mean, we do have some plans around that on the on our roadmap, but I'd love to talk to you about the use case, because you may not need bare metal to do what you want to do.
That's kind of the key point, isn't it? What's the use case?
Yeah, and so happy to chat with you afterwards.
Yeah, same. The use case really makes a difference here. We do this today with SAP. We actually host SAP bare metal to run SAP HANA for their largest workloads. That's something we didn't do before, but with SAP, we decided it would be a good thing to do. So we are doing that. We have talked with many other partners as well. So if it, I think the goal really is not to become a hoster. If you were to talk to all of us, it would be, hey, do you have a multi-tenant system or an application that has, that is going to have a huge following or a big customer base that you need a place to host that integrates well with one of our offerings, then we're more than willing to talk. I think opening up a data center floor and allowing you to roll in racks of servers, I'm not sure that would be how I would classify it.
Yeah,
I would say it's more of a
Well, the other
solution-based.
piece is that a bare metal configuration is not necessarily going to allow you to take advantage of a lot of
Hyperscale,
rich
yeah.
services that exist in our clouds.
Is bare metal cloud?
So what I need is actually the rapid provisioning of bare metal machines because part of my product is a custom hypervisor that sits directly on top of bare metal. So I can't, my ideal situation is that I can provision bare metal machines inside of one of your clouds and then take advantage of all the other services around that.
Above the hypervisor.
Interesting.
That's interesting.
You can't containerize
Yeah.
it?
No, I can't. I need the hypervisor directly on top of bare metal in order to get my stuff done.
It'll be good to hear about the use case later, for sure,
Yeah,
right?
It's interesting.
Yeah, I've got a
Sir?
business card.
Sorry, sir, question over here?
Yeah. So since security education is proven effective on a business and executive level to prevent phishing within companies, what are you doing to solidify endpoint security since you're all catering on a large scale? Is user education really the best outcome? Are alternative practices such as security using virtualization, like the company Bromia is doing, a better option long term?
Wow, good question.
So Edge.
I'm glad I'm not being asked that question. I'm going to throw that to you guys.
Well,
And he's in high school.
awesome.
Hire that
That's
guy.
scary.
Yeah, there's three
That means
companies
we're
up
old.
here who would all like to hire you.
So it depends on what you mean by edge. If you talk about a device, right, that's why I said, the device is now the edge that you need to protect. And so a few things that we're doing from just an end user perspective, and then I'll talk about, if you were doing a virtual desktop, but from an end user perspective, we want to extend that boundary instead of just protecting the data center or the server, right, and protecting a database, right, or a data store. We're going to protect the data. It's going to go down to the data edge. And so we now have, we had rights management service, now we have something called Azure Information Protection. So what it allows you to do is actually protect that data regardless of where it goes and whatever device it's on. And so then you can track that information too and assign policy to it. And so what we're trying to do is move the data protection to the edge, so that it won't matter if you have a managed device or an unmanaged device, that data will be protected, and you'll be able to tell who gained access to that data and where that access to that data goes. But that's all dependent on, do you classify your data? Right? To be able to know how to protect that data, you have to classify your data first. And so it's really important to have a data management strategy so that if you were to create a piece of data, whether it's something coming from an IoT device or it's an actual document or artifact that you're collecting, you need to classify that particular data, either do it manually via human intervention or have it automatically classified before it leaves, right, your virtual boundary. And so those are the types of things we're looking at is how do we actually do encryption, and not just the way we think about it at rest and in transit, but always keep it encrypted, regardless of where it is on the edge, if that makes sense.
And I think that's a great question because I get to put in a shameless plug here. So I would encourage everybody to read Google's Beyond Corp paper. And this talks about how we think about securing networks and services and what we've done for our own enterprise. We've actually commercialized this as part of our cloud services. It's our identity-aware proxy. And actually, Microsoft just released a product that's very similar. And I think there's some really interesting concepts in there that people can apply to their security profiles and to their estate. The other thing is that I have to make my public service announcement. It doesn't matter who you're using. Please, please, please embrace physical two-factor authentication.
No, yeah, that's
Yes.
sure.
And we just did an announcement of our advanced protection program where we're making this available to consumer accounts. But we urge that as a very strong principle for our enterprise customers. So
That's true for individuals. I mean, anybody should be using two-factor these days. Final word, because I think we are now at the end.
Thank you all. I think you guys did a great job asking questions. You did as well, John.
Oh, thanks a
Good
lot.
job.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.